Trotskyism is the theory of Marxism as advocated by Leon Trotsky. Trotsky identified himself as an orthodox Marxist and Bolshevik-Leninist, and supported founding a vanguard party of the proletariat, proletarian internationalism, and a dictatorship of the proletariat based on working-class self-emancipation and mass democracy. Trotskyists are critical of Stalinism, as they oppose the idea of socialism in one country. Trotskyists also criticize the bureaucracy that developed in the USSR under Stalin. Vladimir Lenin and Trotsky were close both ideologically and personally during the Russian Revolution and its aftermath, and some call Trotsky its co-leader. However, Lenin criticized Trotsky's ideas and intra-party political habits. Trotsky was the paramount leader of the Soviet Red Army in the direct aftermath of the revolutionary period. Trotsky originally opposed some aspects of Leninism. Later, he concluded that unity between the Mensheviks and Bolsheviks was impossible, and joined the Bolsheviks. Trotsky played a leading role with Lenin in the revolution. Assessing Trotsky, Lenin wrote, "Trotsky long ago said that unification is impossible. Trotsky understood this, and from that time on there has been no better Bolshevik." Trotsky's Fourth International was established in France in 1938 when Trotskyists argued that the Comintern of Third International had become irretrievably lost to Stalinism, and thus incapable of leading the international working class to political power. In contemporary English language usage, an advocate of Trotsky's ideas is often called a Trotskyist. A Trotskyist can be called a Trotskyite or trot, especially by a critic of Trotskyism. Definition: James P. Cannon, an American Trotskyist, wrote in his History of American Trotskyism, "Trotskyism is not a new movement, a new doctrine, but the restoration, the revival of genuine Marxism as it was expounded and practiced in the Russian Revolution and in the early days of the Communist International." According to Trotsky, his thought could be distinguished from other Marxist theories by 5 key elements: support for the strategy of permanent revolution, in opposition to the two-stage theory of his opponents; criticism of the post-1924 leadership of the Soviet Union, analysis of its features and after 1933, support for political revolution in the Soviet Union and in what Trotskyists termed the deformed workers' states, support for social revolution in the advanced capitalist countries through working-class mass action, support for proletarian internationalism, and use of a transitional program of demands that bridge between daily struggles of the working class and the maximal ideas of the socialist transformation of society. On the political spectrum of Marxism, Trotskyists are usually considered to be toward the left. In the 1920s they called themselves the left opposition, although today's left communism is distinct and usually non-Bolshevik. The terminological disagreement can be confusing because different versions of a left-right political spectrum are used. Anti-revisionists consider themselves the ultimate leftists on a spectrum from communism on the left to imperialist capitalism on the right. But given that Stalinism is often labeled rightist within the communist spectrum and left communism leftist, anti-revisionists' idea of left is very different from that of left communism. Trotsky and Stalin, despite being Bolshevik-Leninist comrades during the Russian Revolution and Russian Civil War, became enemies in the 1920s and thereafter opposed the legitimacy of each other's forms of Leninism. Thus Trotskyists supported the de-Stalinization that occurred in the 1950s and 1960s under Nikita Khrushchev, and they supported democratic rights in the USSR. This can be confusing to Westerners and thus requires some explanation to be clearly understood. Trotskyism supports Soviet democracy and the legitimacy of one-party rule, as did the Khrushchev-era reformers, because, like other forms of Leninism, it believes in the eternal equivalence of the party and the people. Thus Trotskyism is anti-Stalinist and supportive of a certain kind of democracy within socialism, despite being Leninist and what many left communists would consider totalitarian. Trotskyists opposed political deals with the capitalist powers and advocated a spreading of the revolution throughout Europe and Asia. Theory: permanent revolution. In 1905, Trotsky formulated a theory that became known as the theory of permanent revolution. It is one of the defining characteristics of Trotskyism. Until 1905, Marxism only claimed that a revolution in European capitalist society would lead to a socialist one. According to the original theory, it was impossible for such to occur in more backward countries such as early 20th century Russia. Russia in 1905 was widely considered to have not yet established a capitalist society, but was instead largely feudal with a small, weak and almost powerless capitalist class. The theory of permanent revolution addressed the question of how such feudal regimes were to be overthrown, and how socialism could be established given the lack of economic prerequisites. Trotsky argued that in Russia only the working class could overthrow feudalism and win the support of the peasantry. Furthermore, he argued that the Russian working class would not stop there. They would win its own revolution against the weak capitalist class, establish a workers' state in Russia, and appeal to the working class in the advanced capitalist countries around the world. As a result, the global working class would come to Russia's aid, and socialism could develop worldwide. Capitalist to bourgeois democratic revolution. Revolutions in Britain in the 17th century and in France in 1789 abolished feudalism and established the basic requisites for the development of capitalism. Trotsky argued that these revolutions would not be repeated in Russia. In Results and Prospects, written in 1906, Trotsky outlines his theory in detail, arguing, history does not repeat itself. However much one may compare the Russian Revolution with the Great French Revolution, the former can never be transformed into a repetition of the latter. Quote, in the French Revolution of 1789, France experienced what Marxists called a bourgeois democratic revolution. A regime was established wherein the bourgeoisie overthrew the existing French feudalistic system. The bourgeoisie then moved towards establishing a regime of democratic parliamentary institutions. However, while democratic rights were extended to the bourgeoisie, they were not generally extended to a universal franchise. The freedom for workers to organize unions or to strike was not achieved without considerable struggle. Trotsky argues that countries like Russia had no enlightened, active, revolutionary bourgeoisie which could play the same role, and the working class constituted a very small minority. By the time of the European revolutions of 1848, the bourgeoisie was already unable to play a comparable role. It did not want and was not able to undertake the revolutionary liquidation of the social system that stood in its path to power. Theory of permanent revolution. The theory of permanent revolution considers that in many countries which are thought under Trotskyism to have not yet completed a bourgeois democratic revolution, the capitalist class opposes the creation of any revolutionary situation. They fear stirring the working class into fighting for its own revolutionary aspirations against their exploitation by capitalism. In Russia, the working class, although a small minority in a predominantly peasant-based society, were organized in vast factories owned by the capitalist class, and into large working-class districts. During the Russian Revolution Revolution of 1905, the capitalist class found it necessary to ally with reactionary elements such as the essentially feudal landlords and ultimately the existing, Tsarist Russian state forces. This was to protect their ownership of the property, factories, banks, etc., from expropriation by the revolutionary working class. Therefore, according to the theory of permanent revolution, the capitalist classes of economically backward countries are weak and incapable of carrying through revolutionary change. As a result, they are linked to and rely on the feudal landowners in many ways. Thus, Trotsky argues, because a majority of the branches of industry in Russia were originated under the direct influence of government measures, sometimes with the help of government subsidies, the capitalist class was again tied to the ruling elite. The capitalist class were subservient to European capital. Working class steps in. Instead, Trotsky argued only the proletariat or working class were capable of achieving the tasks of that bourgeois revolution. In 1905, the working class in Russia, a generation brought together in vast factories from the relative isolation of peasant life, saw the result of its labor as a vast collective effort, and the only means of struggling against its oppression in terms of a collective effort, also forming workers' councils. In the course of the revolution of that year, in 1906, Trotsky argued, the factory system brings the proletariat to the foreground. The proletariat immediately found itself concentrated in tremendous masses, while between these masses and the autocracy there stood a capitalist bourgeoisie, very small in numbers, isolated from the people, half foreign, without historical traditions, and inspired only by the greed for gain. The Putilov factory, for instance, numbered 12,000 workers in 1900, and, according to Trotsky, 36,000 in July 1917. The theory of permanent revolution considers that the peasantry as a whole cannot take on this task, because it is dispersed in small holdings throughout the country, and forms a heterogeneous grouping, including the rich peasants who employ rural workers and aspire to landlordism, as well as the poor peasants who aspire to own more land. Trotsky argues, all historical experience shows that the peasantry are absolutely incapable of taking up an independent political role. Trotskyists differ on the extent to which this is true today, but even the most orthodox tend to recognize in the late 20th century a new development in the revolts of the rural poor, the self-organizing struggles of the landless, and many other struggles which in some ways reflect the militant united organized struggles of the working class, and which to various degrees do not bear the marks of class divisions typical of the heroic peasant struggles of previous epochs. However, orthodox Trotskyists today still argue that the town and city-based working class struggle is central to the task of a successful socialist revolution. Linked to these struggles of the rural poor, they argue that the working class learns of necessity to conduct collective struggle, for instance in trade unions, arising from its social conditions in the factories and workplaces, and that the collective consciousness it achieves as a result is an essential ingredient of the socialist reconstruction of society. Although only a small minority in Russian society, the proletariat would lead a revolution to emancipate the peasantry and thus secure the support of the peasantry as part of the revolution, on whose support it will rely. But the working class, in order to improve their own conditions, will find it necessary to create a revolution of their own, which would accomplish both the bourgeois revolution and then establish a workers' state. International revolution. According to classical Marxism, revolution in peasant-based countries such as Russia prepares the ground ultimately only for a development of capitalism, since the liberated peasants become small owners, producers and traders, which leads to the growth of commodity markets, from which a new capitalist class emerges. Only fully developed capitalist conditions prepare the basis for socialism. Trotsky agreed that a new socialist state and economy in a country like Russia would not be able to hold out against the pressures of a hostile capitalist world, as well as the internal pressures of its backward economy. The revolution, Trotsky argued, must quickly spread to capitalist countries, bringing about a socialist revolution which must spread worldwide. In this way the revolution is permanent, moving out of necessity first from the bourgeois revolution to the workers' revolution, and from there uninterruptedly to European and worldwide revolutions. This was the position, contrary to that of classical Marxism, which by that time had been further illuminated by active life, shared by Trotsky and Lenin and the Bolsheviks until 1924, when Joseph Stalin, who along with Kamenev in February 1917 had taken the Menshevik position of first the bourgeois revolution, only to be confronted by Lenin and his famous April thesis on Lenin's return to Russia. After the death of Lenin, and seeking to consolidate his growing bureaucratic control of the Bolshevik Party, began to put forward the slogan of socialism in one country. An internationalist outlook of permanent revolution is found in the works of Karl Marx. The term permanent revolution is taken from a remark of Marx from his March 1850 address. "It is our task," Marx said, "to make the revolution permanent until all the more or less propertied classes have been driven from the ruling positions, until the proletariat has conquered state power, and until the association of the proletarians has progressed sufficiently far, not only in one country but in all the leading countries of the world, that competition between the proletarians of these countries ceases, and at least the decisive forces of production are concentrated in the hands of the workers."